Okay, good afternoon, everyone. All power to the people. We're about to begin. We're a few minutes behind schedule, but not by very much. I want to welcome all of you to the Claim Malcolm X Day and Malcolm X Commemoration Project. If you could just bear with me, we're going to get started and put some stuff up on the screen so we can proceed. I'm going to ask Sister Tasha to help us with the timekeeping part of this and make sure that we adhere to the schedule that we're about to lay out as much as possible. So here we are. We're going to start just going over just a few things. So again, I want to welcome everyone. This is 2021 Claim Malcolm X Day, Malcolm X Commemoration Project. The theme for this year is where do we go from here? And we want to get started. So again, Claim Malcolm X Day and the Malcolm X Commemoration Project. Join the community in the panel for what we hope to be a lively and informative discussion regarding the theme for this year, which is where do we go from here? Unfortunately, Brother Robert Rice will not be able to participate unless there's some miracle that occurs. He's in transit, he's out of town and he's in transit, and I'm not sure if he'll be able to connect with us even online at this point, just because of some unexpected difficulties as far as air transportation. But if he can join us, we certainly will welcome Brother Robert and we will connect him. I'm going to go over the program agenda. My name is Khalid Rahim. I'm the founder and the chairman for New African Independence Party. So again, the theme for this year is where do we go from here? And we're going to go over the program narrative. Then we're going to have an introduction of the panel based on their bios or their biographies. And then we're going to discuss the program format. And we're going to go over the questions for the panel. And they will have a chance to respond. Originally, everyone would have been allowed about 3 minutes. That may change depending on how many people we have who are able to continue as panelists. Closing comments from the panelists, everyone will get about 5 minutes each, and then we'll have a conclusion. So let's get started. Again, Claim Malcolm X Day and the Malcolm X Commemoration Project. The theme for this year, 2021, is where do we go from here? This year, we combined our traditional Malcolm X birthday celebration with the annual Commemoration Project presentations and discussion. Our theme for 2021 is where do we go from here? This theme is both timely and appropriate, especially in light of more recent social and economic developments, such as the chronic police murders and assaults upon the Black or New African community and others, the massive protests, demonstrations, and resistance to murderous and violent police assaults, the lingering public health and economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, the growing crisis of homelessness and gentrification, the effects and impact of climate change and environmental poisoning, and last but certainly not least, the armed ultra-militancy of white supremacists and white nationalist forces. The questions for the panelists or the panel will be 6. Question number 1, protest, boycott, political activism, armed intervention, economic activism, where do we go from here? Question number 2, how should we approach collective work and responsibility in movement building? Question number 3, what are some examples of self-care? Question number 4, What does it mean to maintain hope and optimism? And question number 5, since the 1960s, has there been any progress made in the Black liberation movement? If yes or no, please explain. And finally, since the 1960s, has there been any improvement in the material conditions of Black people? Whether you answer yes or no, please explain. Uh, Panelists should frame their response within the life, the legacy, and political philosophy of Malcolm X, El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz, in combination with their own personal histories, experiences, and analysis. And hopefully, people will be able to use the books, the speeches, the videos, and the various studies concerning Brother Malcolm as a reference point. So we'll talk about the program format. Again, Claim Malcolm X Day is a national grassroots initiative celebrated on Malcolm X's birthday, which we all know is May the 19th. The Malcolm X Commemoration Project, on the other hand, is an initiative of the NAIP, which celebrates and profiles the philosophy and politics of Malcolm X as they apply to contemporary issues. So what I'd like to do now is to provide the brief bio of Brother Brian Francisco. Brian Francisco grew up in Dallas, Texas, grew up in the Dallas, Texas area. In college, he joined the National Society of Black Engineers, an organization whose mission includes striving for Black excellence and positively impacting the community, which provided Brian a great foundation for becoming involved in community building later in life. Brian graduated from the University of Texas at Dallas with a Bachelor of Science degree in electrical engineering. His professional work in telecommunications engineering led him to the Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania area, where he became one of the original members of the new African Independence Party and is now serving as the national deputy chairman. Through his work with the party, Brian is able to pursue his passion for justice and human rights for Black and New African communities throughout the country. He currently resides in the Canton, Ohio area. Now, again, we have to apologize. Brother Robert Rice, who originally was scheduled to be a panelist, appears to be unable to make the event. I do believe he's in transit, he's out of town, there's some issues with the airlines. So I'm not sure if he'll be able to chime in at all or tune in at all. What I'd like to do now is just to give an overview of how the panel, which right now includes myself and Brother Brian, will respond to the different questions.
Brother Khalid, I just wanted to take a quick moment to thank you so much for that warm welcome. And if you can, allow me to start my video because I'm unable to actually start it.
Okay, I didn't understand the last part of your comment, Brian.
I was just saying that I'm attempting to start my video, and Zoom is not allowing me. So if you can allow that feature for me.
Okay, all right. Well, just a moment. Let me go over this part. Okay, so as far as how people will respond to the questions, originally it was supposed to be three member panel. Right now it's just two of us. And so we'll just rotate between Brian and myself, unless someone else decides to step up and volunteer. And so that will be the order as far as the 6 questions. Okay, now, Brian, could you repeat again? You said you were having some technical difficulties with Zoom.
Yes, I'm attempting to start my video. And when I click on that option, it says unable to start. You can't start your video because the host has stopped it. So if you can allow that feature.
Okay, so when I deal with the share issue, then we'll be able to, you can start your video. Is that what you're saying?
I think you actually will have to allow that feature. That there's a feature that you need to allow for me to be able to share my video.
Okay, all right. Well, just give us a moment. We'll get
Okay.
to it as quickly as possible. Thanks.
Sure.
Okay, all right. Okay, I'm not sure about what function you're referring to, Brian, as far as your particular video. Is it just a screen share? Because if it's just a screen share, I do believe as a panelist, you can utilize the screen share. And if that's not the case, we can make sure we can correct that quickly. So let me see if there's more to this. I'll just make you a co-host, and then you should be able to share your video, hopefully, from there. Is that okay?
Yes.
Okay, well, there you go.
Thank you so much. Okay, let me see if I can okay. See if I can share my screen. Or would you like to go ahead with the presenting of the questions?
No problem. Okay, so let's deal with that first.
Okay.
All right. Okay. All right. So the first question is protest, boycott, political activism, armed intervention, economic activism. Where do we go from here? So again, protest, boycott, political activism, armed intervention, economic activism. Where do we go from here? So you can respond first, Brother Brian.
Okay, give me a moment. I'm gonna start screen sharing. Thank you again so much for everybody for joining us today. It is an honor and a pleasure to be able to, for all of us to be able to be here today and to discuss Brother Malcolm and his philosophy. The question number one that we're talking about Where do we go from here as it relates to different tactics, protesting, boycotting, political activism, armed intervention, and economic activism. A lot of this was addressed in Malcolm X's speech, "The Ballot or the Bullet," which he delivered April the in April of 1964. He delivered it. I believe the first was on April the 3rd of 1964 in Cleveland, and then the one that was actually that's been widely recorded and distributed was delivered on April the 12th in Detroit, Michigan. And he, throughout that speech, um, he addressed almost each one of these points uh, in separate, in different ways throughout the speech. And one of the things that he encouraged us to do, especially in that speech, was to look at our struggle or our to frame what we were doing or frame our politics, our political philosophy as a philosophy of Black nationalism, not just a struggle for civil rights, but also taking it a step further for human rights and also looking at it from the lens of nationalism. And those of us that are in the here in the NAIP, we follow that philosophy, and we even expanded it to include a revolutionary Black nationalism. But one of the things that was so prevalent at that time was the protests and the sit-ins for being able to sit at lunch counters and things like that. And one of the things that he mentioned in this speech was that we've done enough sitting. It's time for us to stand and fight back. We don't want to just keep referring to what we're doing as a sit as a sit-in, because a chump can sit, a hypocrite can sit, but what we've done enough of that, and it's time for us to actually start standing and fighting back. And um so we can take that quote and we can take that um and use that as an example. Yes, we still need to protest, and yes, we still need to uh whenever injustice is done to us, we definitely can protest and let that be known. But think about it not just from a standpoint of, oh, we're just getting civil rights, but we're fighting for something bigger in terms of freedom and liberation. As it comes to boycotting, um, he mentioned in the speech the uh, the importance of controlling the economics in your own neighborhoods and your own communities. Uh, he looked further just beyond the he did a further analysis of why a boycott is even needed. And if you don't control the economics in your community, if you don't or if you're not employing yourself, if you don't have options to be able to feed yourself and your family, then a boycott is something that since you're boycotting when all others that won't hire you and will discriminate against you do not allow you to uh, be able to take care of yourself. So what his philosophy was, and what he encouraged in Black nationalism, was for us to take it a step further and do what we could to control the economics in our community so that we wouldn't have to be forced to go into uh, this strategy of using a boycott. and that goes right in hand with economic activism. If and it includes us spending our dollar with our community, not running, taking our dollar and spending it with the man, as he said, but spending it with our own stores and within our own community. And in that particular way, we are actually building up ourselves, and the economic activism that we practice helps to us for us not to have to boycott. But in situations where it is necessary, um, then that's a viable strategy as well. But we want to be looking long term and long range for other options that we don't have to do that. Um, and now we can address political activism. The same thing. It goes the underlying theory of philosophy of Black nationalism is controlling our own. So that means controlling our politics, controlling our economics, controlling our defense, and going back to this particular point that we're addressing right now, the political activism, um, making making sure that we control those politics, and that's why the party was particularly founded, was to address that, to be able to run our own candidates, support our own candidates, be able to influence issues that affect our community, so that our community is benefited and not um, someone else's interest is not come precedent over what the issues that we have in our community. So he highly stressed that also in this speech, The Ballot or the Bullet, as well. I reference it so heavily on this slide because it really just answers a lot of this question as to far as where we should be going in this particular direction. And last, I'll deal with the armed intervention aspect. Have- what made Malcolm one of my favorite heroes was the fact that he took such a strong stance on self-defense, on being able to protect ourselves against whatever threats we might be facing. And it's one of those things that actually any you know any it, it's a law of nature where people it's just one of those things where if you're threatened, you should defend yourself. And he addressed that, and even as he was right before he was going to be assassinated, in one of the last publicly recorded speeches, which was delivered on February 14th of 1965, called "After the Firebombing," he was heavily referencing self-defense. He talked about how there was a particular sister that was in the media that had been that was being brutalized by white brutes, as he called them, that were throwing her on the ground, and he was saying that full-grown Negro men standing around, and how that was a personal, that was personally, and he was sad to be able to have to see that, but he said, that we should defend ourselves against all of the threats that are perpetrated on us extra legally. And specifically, he referenced when he speaks like that, that he's saying that, you know, the media and the press has a way of spinning it to say that, oh, he's teaching hate, you know, oh, he's teaching hate, he's just advocating for violence for violence sake. But he's like, no, I don't advocate for violence just to be violent. But if someone is abusing you and taking advantage of you unjustly, then you do have the right to defend yourself. And up until the very end, that was one of the things that he strongly advocated for. So those are my comments as far as the question for question number one.
Well, thank you very much, Brother Brian. Appreciate that. My comments are very much in tune with the commentary that was just delivered by Brian. Yes, I think protests, I think boycott, I think political activism, armed intervention, as well as economic activism, they all play a role as we pursue our freedom and liberation. As a matter of fact, I don't think that anything should be excluded. I think at various moments we have to highlight different aspects as tools to use as we pursue our freedom and liberation. So at some point, we need to put a focus on protests and demonstrations. And at other points, we need to highlight the need for political activism. And at other points, we need to highlight the need for some type of armed intervention. And perhaps it needs to be highlighted, but I believe that political activism and armed intervention have to be permanent fixtures within the Black liberation movement. We have to be able to determine what's in our best interest politically, and we have to be able to protect ourselves and to protect our communities and families. And so everything else should always fluctuate and should always be present. But I really believe that much emphasis has to be put on political activism in the armed protection and intervention. When we look at economic activism, for example, yes, I do agree. There's a difference between the pursuit of economic justice versus economic development. Economic justice is something that we pursue as people who don't yet have self-determination or group determination. And so we're fighting for some type of justice. We want to fight to make sure that if there, say, for example, construction contracts, that a certain number of the people who get jobs through those contracts are Black people. We want to make sure that if there are any type of professional service contracts, like accounting, engineering contracts with the local government, the city, the county, the state, we need to fight and make sure that a certain percentage of the people who are awarded those contracts are our people. And then we have to hold those people accountable to the Black community. So it's not just enough to have a Black face get a contract. We have to hold those contractors accountable to help not just themselves and their business or their company, but to serve the best interests of our community as well. So that's the fight for economic justice. Economic development is a whole different thing, because real, genuine economic development basically is predicated on you having power. You have to have the power to do what's in your best interest economically, not just in the short run, but in the long run. So that means you have to control the means of production, you have to control the means of distribution, and everything that comes along with it, right? That's really what economic development is. Economic development is not open up the neighborhood grocery store saying this is economic development for the Black community. It's a step in the right direction, but that grocer still doesn't control the distribution. That grocer still doesn't control the extraction of any things that are needed to produce whatever he or she is selling on their shelves. And so we talk about economic development in the real technical sense. It involves having power. It involves being able to control the means of distribution, the means of extraction, as well as the means of production. So I do agree that when in a more basic and fundamental way, I do agree with Brother Brian. Just to kind of paraphrase Brother Malcolm, we have to gain control of the economics in our community, but understand that's just a step in the right direction. Ultimately, we have to be able to control, again, the means of distribution, the means of production, and the means of extraction. Boycott, very important. If you can't control it, if other people control it, and if you're pursuing some type of justice, or whether it's in the forms of jobs, whether it's in the forms of opportunities to produce and to distribute, then one of the tools that we can certainly use is to boycott those businesses who have that power, because we can dig deep into their pockets, in their wallets, in their purses, in their pocketbooks, and basically send a message to them that if they don't do justice by us, since we are consumers, then we can exercise our power not to consume goods, products, and services from them. So that is a tool as well. Keeping in mind that Malcolm X was in a certain period, and so there's no doubt that the impact of the Montgomery bus boycott was still fresh in the minds of many people during this time period, because up until the boycott, which occurred in Ferguson, Missouri, as a result of the murder of Michael Brown, up until that point, the Montgomery bus boycott had been the longest and most successful Black boycott in the history of the United States. And so, people still had that fresh in their minds, even in the late 50s and early to mid 60s, as an example of a successful boycott. And it was an example of a tool that could be further used. But I do agree with Malcolm that we have to move just beyond boycotting. And we have to move towards trying to control the economics within our own communities and neighborhoods as best as we can. And we still struggle with that today. And nowadays, it's an even larger problem, because most of the business community has been dwindled down, because there's such a high concentration of goods and services in just a few companies. For example, the Walmart, the Amazons, they control production, they control distribution. I mean, they control the marketing. So it becomes even more problematic to control the economics within your community, because you have fewer and fewer players.
Right.
Many of the small businesses have been crushed, and they've just kind of folded up. This is before the pandemic, right? And so, we have to deal with the impact of what we refer to as globalization. And it's impacted everyone, not just elements within the white working class or small business owners or the petty bourgeoisie amongst the white community, but it's impacted the petty bourgeoisie amongst the Black community and small business owners within the Black community. And so, yes, a lot of lessons from what Malcolm put forward, but we have to look at things also from some other angles as they would apply to our situation today. I guess we're ready for question number 2 now. Is that the next move? I do believe.
Yes.
Okay, let me see what we can do. So question number 2 is, how should we approach collective work and responsibility? Okay, I'm going to be responding to that question first, Brother Brian. So if you could excuse yourself from the screen share right now for the time. Thank you. So in terms of collective work and responsibility, one of the principles, right? I think it's important that when we look at capitalism, for example, because we talk about collective work, we look at capitalism. Capitalism is an economic model and it's a social model. It hasn't worked very well, has it? I mean, it hasn't worked well for the majority of people throughout the world. And we know it doesn't work well for the majority of Black people here within the United States. So when we talk about collective work and responsibility, certainly we need to embrace models that put a focus on uh, us sharing our resources so we can hopefully get the the most good out of it, not just for the individuals, not just for individual like investors, but for the betterment of our communities and neighborhoods. And so we need to talk about worker collectives, right? We need to talk about businesses that are owned by workers themselves, because we believe, again, I think Brian touched upon that. We talk about Black nationalism, but we talk about revolutionary Black nationalism, which means we talk about the need for a different economic model, right? A model based upon principles and ideals and practices of sharing or socialism. And not just the socialism that oftentimes is attributed to the teachings of Marx and Engels or even Mao or other people, but the socialism, the collective sharing that we find deeply embedded within the traditional histories and cultures of African people. And so we talk about new African socialism, the need to create a certain type of socialism amongst the people here within the United States, who are many of us descended from the enslaved Africans who mostly resided in the southern part of this country. And now that doesn't exclude our other brothers and sisters who came a little later on, who came, from the islands, and those who've migrated from the continent, and those who've migrated from throughout the African diaspora. All of us are new Africans who live here within the United States of America. But based on that, based on those histories and based on that legacy, we think that as we deal with collective work and responsibility, that it has to be just that. It has to be based on a model that is inclusive and that really represents the best interests of the Black working class, Black workers, right? And so that would be my response to collective work and responsibility. We have to develop a much more like inclusive model. You know, Brother Malcolm in his early years, he was a staunch Black nationalist. We know that. He was a staunch Black nationalist when he was a member of the Nation of Islam, and he remained a staunch Black nationalist until the day he was assassinated. But Malcolm X wasn't necessarily a socialist per se until later on in his life, when he started to uh, seriously condemn and critique capitalism. And so again, I think when we study Brother Malcolm, we need to look at Brother Malcolm not just as a standalone figure, but see Brother Malcolm in the same way that we see ourselves, that all of us have went through stages and periods of growth and development, and we continue to do so. And so that also applied to Malcolm X. Malcolm X grew, he developed certain types of understandings. So, oftentimes people try to isolate one aspect of Malcolm X's life and say, well, this is Malcolm. And right. So they just like zero in on that part. And so we have some people, they zero in on Malcolm as a minister within the Nation of Islam, especially in his early years. I think he had been a minister for the nation for about 12 years.
Right.
And so some people, they focus on the early Malcolm X, the minister Malcolm X, the fiery speeches, the condemnation of racism and white supremacy, the labeling of all white people as devils, representing the teachings of Honorable Elijah Muhammad, prefacing everything he said with, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad says this, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad teaches me thus. And so some people zero in on that Malcolm X and say, well, this is Malcolm X, right? But they failed to see that Malcolm was growing and he was developing as well. Right. And I'm not just talking about when Malcolm left the nation completely. I'm saying even within the nation, his sojourn within the nation, Malcolm was growing and he was evolving politically and socially. Right. And so when we talk about collective work and responsibility, Malcolm, in the early years of his development, appears to be a very staunch Black capitalist for the most part. Because the Nation of Islam, that's where the Nation of Islam was coming from. Mm-hmm. They believed in Black capitalism. They believed in capitalism, right? And that's what they they didn't call it that, but that's what they practiced. They practiced Black capitalism, right? You know, do for yourself, build your own businesses, so forth and so on. Yes, it was characterized by Black nationalism, but the economic model itself was a capitalist economic model. And we need to be clear about that even today. People say, well, I'm a Black nationalist. Well, you could be a Black nationalist. That doesn't mean that you're anti-capitalist. You could be a Black nationalist, doesn't mean that you're anti-imperialist. We have Black people who say, well, I'm a Black nationalist. Black Lives Matter, but they okay with the United States government supporting Israel to bomb the Palestinians. They okay with the United States government intervening in other people's affairs, right, to control their natural resources or to control their political leadership. But they say, well, I'm a black nationalist. So you could be a Black nationalist and not be anti-capitalist. You could be a Black nationalist even today and not be anti-imperialist. And you know, we have that throughout the Black community. We have that throughout the Black political leadership class. We have a lot of Black political leaders who espouse some form or some degree of Black nationalism. But when you look at their politics, when it comes to international affairs, when it comes to foreign policy, their ideas, uh, they basically mirror the same politics of the most staunchest racist, white supremacist, neo-fascist person sitting across from them in Congress, right?
Right.
So, you know, we have to weigh that. I'm saying that Malcolm X himself reached a certain point when it comes to collective work and responsibility that I think clearly pushes him more towards a socialist type of economic model. Brother Brian, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think towards the end of his life, one of his speeches, he said, and this is just a paraphrase, he said, if you show me a capitalist, I'll show you a bloodsucker, right? And so that
Right.
kind of like,
Right.
you know, that kind of characterizes where Malcolm was towards the end of his life.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's my response to question number two. But you can take it from there, Brother Brian.
Yeah. I'm not exactly sure what speech that was. Let me see. That was, looks like it was, he delivered a speech by any means necessary. That was December 20th of 1964. So there you go, Brother Khalid.
Okay, okay,
So yeah, that was right there towards the end of his life.
okay.
Um, so all right, give me just a moment. So one of the things that I saw as a theme when it comes to collective work and responsibility from Brother Malcolm was how much he stressed unity. It just really seemed like it was a theme for me, unity, 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 and a lot of the speeches that I looked at. For example, one of the ones I referenced was um, this was famous police brutality case that the Nation of Islam dealt with the murder of Brother Ronald Stokes, a member of the Los Angeles Nation of Islam. This speech was called Ronald Stokes Memorial Service, and it was delivered on May the 5th of 1962. And one of the things that he brought about in that speech, or he wanted to give, great honor and praise to all the so-called Negro organizations in that area who unified and who stepped up against the police and against the police brutality that had occurred. Yes, there were the Nation of Islam was a separatist group, but all of the other organizations in the Los Angeles area at that time uh, came together and supported them in their fight for justice in this particular case where Brother Ronald was murdered and the rest of the mosque, several other brothers were brutalized during this process. Um, we also have in the message to the grassroots, which was delivered in 1963, a couple weeks before John F. Kennedy was assassinated, he was stressing unity as well, talking about the common oppressor that those of us have here in the new Africans in the United States have to deal with. And once we realize that this common oppressor, then we have to, it's incumbent upon us to unite against this common enemy and unite uh, on the basis of what we have in common. And Brother Khalid, you speak about this often, and there was a conference that took place in 1954 that Brother Malcolm was heavily influenced by. It was called the Bandung Conference, and it took place in 1954, I believe it was in Indonesia, where several oppressed nations from Asia, I believe India, Africa, and several colonized nations came together to discuss different ways of forming some type of alliance and being able to throw off the chains of colonialism and the different oppression that they all were facing. And this was a heavily influenced Brother Malcolm, and he referenced it in this particular speech as an example for us to be able to uh, come together, put aside our differences, and find out how we can actually uh, utilize what we have in common and build up on our unity to be able to overcome this oppression. And even as he left the Nation of Islam, and he, as you were saying, Brother Khalid, is we don't want to just look at his life just as one particular just just one particular flashpoint. Obviously, it was he was a life of transformation, not just from his time in the nation, but even after the nation, his his philosophy and everything that he was having was expanding, and he did end up outgrowing the Nation of Islam, but he became a further became an internationalist. He became an anti-capitalist, and which further qualified him to be a true revolutionary, not just for the cause of those of us who were being oppressed in the United States, but also all over the world. And especially when he was able to make his pilgrimage to Mecca and his travels throughout Africa, it helped him to be able to see things on a much bigger stage. But I wanted to also reference how he was talking about his through the organization that he founded, um, the Organization of Afro American Unity, in the speech after the firebombing, which was right before he was going to be assassinated, the importance of joining his organization, injecting themselves and joining the so-called civil rights struggle, to be another organization that was unified with the other organizations to be able to overcome this challenge that they were being faced with. Um, and another very seemed to be a very big point with Brother Malcolm as well, in terms of the collective work and especially not just the work, but the personal responsibility was education. And one of the things that he quotes, as you said, especially when he was with the time with the Nation of Islam, Elijah Muhammad teaches us such and such. And in this case, Elijah Muhammad teaches us that all of the things that the Black man, or any man for that matter, can study, history is the best qualified to reward all research. You have to have a knowledge of history, no matter what you are going to do. Anything that you undertake, you have to have a knowledge of history in order for it to be successful, in order to be successful in it. And this was what he, I believe, has said this many times, but I took this in particular from a speech that he delivered December 12th in 1962 as well. So those are my particular comments as far as the answer to this particular question.
Okay. We may as well move on to question number 3, Brian, and you're going to be the first responder for that question.
Excuse me, Brother Khalid and Brother Brian. We're at about 1 o'clock. I just wanted to give you guys a reminder or a heads up about the time.
All right. Thank you very much, Sister Tasha. So we probably need to speed it up a little bit because we do want to have time for anyone who's watching or listening to weigh in, share their experiences, the analysis, or any critique and so forth and so on. So let's move on. Tasha, try to keep us both to 3 minutes from this point forward. Go ahead, Brother Brian.
Okay, so question number 3 are what are some examples of self-care? And I can share a personal story. For those that don't know, I am a paraplegic. I was paralyzed 3 years ago, and I also suffer from a mental health diagnosis. So from my personal experience, I have learned that prioritizing my mental health is one of the number one things that I have to do to be able to have to be able to take care of myself and have, it's very essential to my own personal self-care. Along with that, it's through this whole journey and this whole process, I've had to be able to seek help from professionals. And just like if I had to deal with the trauma, well, I've had to deal with the physical trauma of being paralyzed and the accident that I dealt with that. So I've had to visit various specialists, doctors to deal with my paralysis. Same thing with my mental health diagnosis, psychiatrists and counselor, therapists to be able to help with the mental health challenge. So that's something that is very key as well in being able to prioritize your self-care. One thing that has been big for me also is my relationship with God and more getting in touch with my spiritual side. And you can also see if you look at Brother Malcolm El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz, as he was known once he made his pilgrimage to Mecca, that his relationship with God and his relationship his faith in Islam and his faith in Allah was what was a major point in his transformation, and not just in his transformation, but in his ability to be able to take care of himself, sustain himself as a leader, sustain his trajectory on this life journey that he had. And one of the big things that we can also look referencing his pilgrimage to Mecca and his travel throughout Africa was that time where he had to rejuvenate himself through that, being able to take that vacation. So that he had just left the Nation of Islam. He was kind of under fire from that. And he had that opportunity to make the pilgrimage, the Hajj to Mecca, and then also travel extensively throughout Africa, and that rejuvenated him to be able to come back and continue the struggle here in the U.S.
Thank you very much, Brother Brian. I think everything you said is definitely on point. I'm sure people who are watching and listening who didn't know your background and your history are probably amazed. And so, you know, this is one more reason why Brian has emerged as one of the strongest leaders within the party. You know, he's been able to overcome a lot of challenges and obstacles and still provide leadership to all of us and still, you know, continue to move forward. Let's talk about examples of self-care. And I think Brian touched upon many. Let's talk about Brother Malcolm before he was Malcolm X. And let's talk about the traumatic experiences that he went through. Not just the stuff he went through as far as his family, but let's look at the historical period in which Malcolm was born. Right. Malcolm was born in Omaha, Nebraska, what, 1925?
1920, yeah,
yeah,
May 19th, 1925.
Right, right. He was born in 1925. But if I'm not too, well, I know that in 1921, there was the massacre up in Oklahoma, up in Tulsa.
Right.
But
right.
I also believe that around the time that Malcolm was born, maybe a few years before Malcolm was born, there was a series of so-called race riots that occurred up in Oklahoma where there were several lynchings.
Right.
There was an infamous lynching of a Black man, I do believe, that occurred maybe about 4 or 5 years before Malcolm's birth, right?
Okay.
Or around the time that Malcolm was born. So there's no doubt that things like that had an impact on his upcoming. And we know his family history, you know, his parents being members of UNIA, Universal Negro Improvement Association, under the teachings and guidance of Marcus Garvey and Amy Garvey, both Amy Garveys. But Malcolm dealt with a lot of trauma too. And the reason I'm bringing this up, Malcolm before he became Malcolm X, or Haj Malik El-Shabazz, is because it illustrates for me in many ways much of the trauma that our young people and our young adults go through today.
Right.
Right. And how many of them deal with it, and how they haven't dealt with it in a healthy manner because they haven't been taught how to deal with it in a healthy manner, much in the same way that Malcolm didn't know how to deal with it in a healthy manner. And so Malcolm internalized his anger, his hatred, and you know, he drank, he smoked, he got high, he sold drugs, he pimped women, exploited women. He did a whole bunch of other stuff. He committed robberies, he committed burglaries. He did a lot of the stuff that so-called street youth would do today, having been traumatized and not knowing how to approach that trauma, not knowing how to get the necessary healing, right? And then just like many street youth today, some of them wind up in juvenile facilities or prisons and penitentiaries, and they convert. They either become Muslim, Christian, Hebrew Israelite, Yoruba. They get involved in something spiritually that also has a strong political component that kind of opens up their life, that opens up their mind, opens up their eyes for them. And it gives them a much healthier worldview. And it may not be something that we all agree upon, but it's something that helps them. It helps them to navigate the storm. It helps them to deal with their trauma. And it helps them to make sense of the world that they grew up in the world that they continue to have to live in.
Right.
So I think everything that Brother Brian said is on point. The trauma is all around us. We see it every day. Sometimes we need to turn off the TV, right? Sometimes we need to pick up a book, and sometimes we need to not even pick up a book. Sometimes the information in the books can be so traumatic for us. And sometimes we just need to pray. We take a few moments in prayer, in contemplation, in meditation, or we need to reach out to some mental health professionals. You know, I know for many of us, the only mental health professionals, at least for my generation, the only mental health professional we had was like, you know, mom or dad, mostly grandparents. They were the mental health professionals, or a favorite aunt or a favorite uncle. And depending on the uncle, sometimes you came out more messed up than you were before you talked to him, right? You know, I had some uncles like that. You know, we both needed help by the time we finished talking to each other. But, you know, we need to reach out and try to get some help for ourselves, and so we can move forward. So are we ready to move on to question number 4?
Yes.
Okay. I think this is something I'm going to be answering first. What does it mean to maintain hope and optimism Well, first of all, let's dispense with this idea that we think that hope has to be based on a false sense of reality. That's not what we are saying here. You know, we're saying that hope and optimism, first of all, we know it's predicated on your faith, but it also has to be based upon making a realistic assessment of where you live and who you are in this world, right? And so if you hope to be free and if you hope to be liberated, then that hope has to be based on some concrete assessment and evaluation, right? Like you need to know some basic things about not just who you are, but you have to understand some basic things about the system that you currently operate in, the system that you currently live in. And so your hope and your optimism has to be based upon that. So we don't believe in blind faith hope or blind faith optimism. And, you know, I think that Malcolm X epitomized that, especially towards the end of his life. I think, again, he continued to grow, he continued to evolve uh, ideologically and spiritually. Um, and when I say spiritually and ideologically, yes, I think Malcolm had at some point eclipsed the basic fundamental teachings that he had gotten from the Nation of Islam and through the teachings of Elijah Muhammad. But I need to make this perfectly clear. Um, Elijah Muhammad does not get the credit and recognition that he rightfully deserves. He, without a doubt, is one of the greatest Black nationalist leaders in the latter half of the 20th century, without a doubt. You know, oftentimes we applaud Marcus Garvey because Marcus Garvey had the largest Black nationalist organization or Pan-Africanist organization, if you want to say. So if you want to talk about Blacks throughout the African diaspora, Marcus Garvey had the largest Pan-Africanist group in the history of the world as we know it. And he had the largest Black nationalist group within the United States of America. But the second largest Black nationalist group, or perhaps the third largest Black nationalist group, and I need to qualify between second and third, was the Nation of Islam, right? And, you know, you're talking about an organization that had tens of thousands of members. Some would even argue a couple of 100,000 members, right? So we need to give credit to where credit is due. And that has nothing to do with perhaps our theological differences or perhaps our political differences or ideological differences. We need to give credit to where credit is due. And Elijah Muhammad was able, through his understanding and his teachings at that particular period of time in the history of the United States, the world, and the history of Black America, he was able to recruit and shape and mold people like Malcolm X, Louis Farrakhan, right? Wharf Dean Muhammad, you know, Ali. We could go on, and then the countless women that many of us know nothing about who were leaders within the Nation of Islam, who don't get a lot of recognition or credit. So I just need to put that out there so we can be critical, and we can be critical and be principled in our criticism without derailing people or taking away from their achievements and accomplishments. We we love Michael Jordan and we love Dr. J, but we all know that Michael Jordan and Dr. J are both human beings, and they have not been perfect. They may be perfect on the basketball court to some degree, but they haven't been perfect in terms of just being people. And we know that because none of us are perfect, right? So I just want to put that out there. So I guess we can move on. And I think the next question is, what is the next question? Brian, Tasha, someone
Yeah,
help me out.
well, I wanted to, I guess I kind of had a little bit to say about this question. What does it mean to maintain hope and optimism?
Oh, yes, I'm
Uh,
sorry. Yeah.
yeah, let me, give me just a moment also. And it pretty much is pretty much in line with what you were saying as well. And I still go back to Brother Malcolm's strong spiritual foundation, and as you mentioned, it really was started through his work, through his involvement with being with the Nation of Islam. So what we can do today is just realize that we're still on a course for freedom and liberation. And you know, there's a proper phrase that's out there that life is about the journey, not the destination. Even though we have destination, you know, what we're striving for, at the same time we can relish the journey that we're on, where we can relish the process, the development that we have, day by day, step by step.
Very
So
well said.
yeah, I didn't have too much to say on that. I just wanted to point that out.
Okay. Thank you, Brian. So question number 5, we're going to question. Okay. Uh, I think you answered this first, Brian.
Yeah, so number 5 is, since the 1960s, has there been any progress made in the Black liberation movement? So if you just go by the acronym BLM, in today's time, if anybody mentions BLM, the first thing that comes to your mind is Black Lives Matter. And with a lot of us, don't even know the history, unless you were around at that time, that BLM originally, or back in the 60s and 70s, actually stood for the Black Liberation Movement, which was basically the movement that was Malcolm was a part of, and really got ramped up after his assassination. The Black Panther Party was actually founded the year after he was assassinated, and so the Black Liberation Movement um, continued on and was highly motivated and inspired by his teachings. So here today, we have the Black Lives Matter movement, which is not necessarily a movement for freedom and liberation like the Black Liberation Movement was back in the late 60s and early 70s. We can see that um, what it really kind of got spawned out of and spearheaded was with the um, murders, unjust murders of uh, individuals such as Trayvon Martin and Tamir Rice and Michael Brown, and even with the major recent ones that we've had with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. So we have massive protests and demonstrations, uh, basically um, trying to say that our life matters, but not taking into the full account of a fight and a movement for complete and total liberation, and which was fully explored by organizations such as the Black Panther Party, the Black Liberation Army, and others. Um, and with that being said, I have on this slide some information about political prisoners who were, uh, you know, individuals such as myself nowadays, or even comrades of Brother Khalid at that time in the 60s, late 60s, early 70s, who were involved in this movement of for Black liberation, and it were targets of the government and have been imprisoned, and many of them have been imprisoned for many, if not all, have been imprisoned for decades. Some sentenced to death. Some have actually died in prison because of their fight for liberation. And there has been, unfortunately, this is a travesty, in my opinion, because those people who were making those sacrifices and making those deep personal and political sacrifices have just, you know, in many cases have been forgotten about. Uh, you know, the Black Lives Matter, we chant and we say justice for George Floyd. We say justice for Breonna Taylor, but what about justice for Mumi Abu Jamal? What about justice for Sundiata Acoli? What about justice for Mutulu Shakur? People who were even justice for Fred Hampton, who were, you know, that was a police brutality case that took place in the 60s. No justice delivered in that, just like with, you know, the justice that we don't get now. But since it's not necessarily in our face, and we've moved on and gotten distracted, and the way that the media works, it kind of helps, has a way of prioritizing who are our freedom, of who we should be fighting for, when we actually have a real freedom fighters who are still locked up. So to answer this question directly, there has been some progress made, because we have one of the brothers, we've had actually a few of our comrades and brothers who have been liberated. Jalil Muntakim was the most recent, and he's actually on this slide. He was liberated.
Excuse me, Brother Brian, you're like 2 minutes over.
Okay. So I guess the bottom line is that we need to refocus on liberating our political prisoners. So,
All right. Okay. Well, thank you,
go ahead.
Brian. I really appreciate those comments. Yes, and I agree with Brian that we do need to focus and rechannel a lot of our energy on liberation for political prisoners, and liberation for political prisoners from the 60s and 70s and early 80s, but also liberation for the current breed of political prisoners. We have a lot of younger political prisoners who have been incarcerated as a result of taking action against police violence and murder. We have political prisoners who have been incarcerated as a result of the uprising that occurred because of the police murder of Mike Brown up in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014. We have political prisoners who have been charged, and some are facing incarceration as a result of the uprisings from last year in connection with the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and others. So we have a new generation of political prisoners. Most are Black, some are people of color, and a few are white. And we need to not forget them, and we need to not make the mistakes with the new generation of political prisoners that my generation made with the earlier groups of political prisoners. So I agree with Brother Brian 100%. In terms of the progress, I don't think we've made too much substantial progress since the 1960s and early 70s. I think over the last few years, we've seen some major shifts in the consciousness of especially younger Black and brown and other people of color, right? But as far as any major progress, my answer would be no. As a matter of fact, I think we've retrogressed in many ways. So that would be my response. Brian, I'm gonna let you take over for one moment, excuse me.
Okay.
All right.
So there, I'll move on to the last question. And this is kind of a progress question as well. Since the 1960s, has there been any improvement in the material conditions of Black people? And I guess you can say in a lot of ways, yes, it has. For example, we've seen the destruction of segregation. So, you know, fortunately, we can go to travel wherever we want, go to whatever hotel we want to, restaurant, you know, things of that sort. It was a major struggle for travel, early travel, in the early parts of this century and even up until the middle of the century, where our people would, you know, try to uh, make a trip from, say, the South to other parts of the country, and they had to, you know, plan their trip with keeping in mind where they would actually be able to have um, safe a safe place to be able to stay the night if they got tired, and issues like that. There's a book called The Great Migration that actually talks about one of the characters, and his harrowing journey from the state of Louisiana to the state of California. And he was, I believe he was traveling in Arizona, and he made an attempt to um, stop at a hotel in, I believe it was Phoenix, and there, all the hotels that he stopped at, even though he was no longer in the South, they did not allow for him to be able to stay there and stay the night. And that was, you know, very devastating to him, obviously, because when you're so tired and driving through the night, you need some place to stay. And fortunately for us, those of us in this generation, I've made that trip, you know, from Texas to California several times. And even though nowadays we kind of do things kind of crazy because we have the interstate where we can uh, almost drive straight through, but we have the opportunity that if we need some place to stay or stop, we don't have to face that level of discrimination. So there has been an improvement in the material conditions as far as that goes. But we still have to deal with, as we were talking about, the social ills such as the mass incarceration and the proliferation of drugs and the challenges with our health issues, environmental issues, as well as the state sanctioned violence. So in some ways, yes, and in some other ways, no. That'd be my answer.
Okay, well, thank you, Brother Brian. I had to step away just for one moment, but I heard the last parts of your comments, and I think you're very much on point. Yeah, there has been some improvement in the material conditions of Black people. Again, you know, it kind of goes back to the previous question about gains made during the civil rights, not civil rights, but the Black liberation movement. So I kind of need to go back to question number 5. One of the things that I do when people ask me about the civil rights movement, and they oftentimes include everything within that period as the civil rights movement. They include, say, the Montgomery bus boycott, the murder of Emmett Till, throughout, say, for example, the election of certain Black public officials. They include all of that into the civil rights movement. They include the Black Panther Party, Republican of Africa. They say all of this is the civil rights movement. And so I always took a different position as I got older and I did more research and I started to think about it a little differently. I saw 3 different types of movements within the Black community, 3 different large movements within the Black community. And within each movement, you had different tendencies and different components. Some were cultural, some were more political, some were more economic. But you had the traditional civil rights movement, which basically focused on the dismantling of Jim Crow. And I think Brian spoke to that earlier when he talks about the destruction of segregation as a material improvement of the conditions within the Black community, the national Black community. So I look at the civil rights movement, and then I look at the Black Power movement, but the Black Power movement with a focus on Black political power as embodied in electoral politics. In the Black Power movement, symbolized by Black people being able to enter areas that previously they could not enter due to Jim Crow. whether that Jim Crow was legal or whether that Jim Crow was de facto by social practice. And so during that period of Black Power, we see more and more Black faces appearing in the media, more and more Black faces on TV, more and more Black faces on film, a few more Black faces on Broadway, involved in theater, and then more and more Black faces creating independent theater, but still connected to mainstream theater. More and more Black people finding entrance into predominantly white universities and colleges. So we see more and more Black faces in academia. We see more and more Black media personalities being exposed to a broader, i.e. whiter audience. We see more and more Black people being able to find entrance into corporate America. Most of the time, you know, giving titles of vice president this and vice president of that, but basically the vice presidency was around how things would look. So the vice president of human resources, right? The vice president of community relationships, the vice president of public relations and stuff like that, but not an executive vice president that would really have any say-so over how things are going to get done and what the outcomes may look like within mainstream corporate America. So this is that Black Power period. And then you get what I consider to be the third component, which is the Black Liberation Movement. And the Black Liberation Movement distinguishes itself because it's not just a struggle or battle to dismantle Jim Crow or for more access into dominant white systems and dominant white societies, but it's a struggle for self-determination. It's a struggle to have Black people determine for themselves what is in our best collective interest. And so that's when you see the groups of organizations like the Black Panther Party, the Republic of New Africa, even the Nation of Islam to a certain extent, even though I would consider the Nation of Islam to be more of a bourgeois Black nationalist formation. But, you know, so three different eras: civil rights, Black Power, and you know, Black Power with an asterisk behind it, because there's a strong connection between Black Power and Black liberation. But oftentimes the Black Power thing that developed in the late 60s throughout the 70s, oftentimes it was prefaced as Black political power, which means that you were a member of the Democratic Party, or it was prefaced with Black economic power, which means that your economic model was capitalism or Black capitalism. There's a great book to read that I'll encourage everyone to read. It's a classic. It's called Black Awakening in White America. It's called, what is it called?
I think it's called Black Awakening in Capitalist America.
There you go. Thank you very much, Brother Brian. Black Awakening in Capitalist America by Robert Allen, correct? I think it's by Robert Allen, Brian?
Yeah,
right.
I believe so.
Right. So check out Black Awakening in Capitalist America by Robert Allen. It's a classic book. It kind of exposes how the whole thing with the notion that Black capitalism was a cure-all or a panacea for what ails the Black community, how that was developed and how that was pushed. And it may shock many people to find out that one of the strongest advocates for Black capitalism was actually Richard Nixon, right? And it was used as a tool to disempower and to muffle, right, the voices coming from the Black liberation movement that were demanding not Black capitalism, but were demanding Black freedom and self-determination and liberation, right? The groups like the Black Panther Party, the groups like the Republic of New Africa, and other such formations, right? So, you know, I try to draw those distinctions: civil rights, Black Power with an asterisk on it, and also the Black liberation movement. So yes, have we made some material gains? Yes, we have. I mean, you know, we have made some pretty decent material gains, and now that we have more Black millionaires than we had before, we have probably at least one or two Black billionaires. We didn't have that before. We have more Blacks who have been able to get a college degree in education. We have more Blacks who have graduated from high school. We have more Blacks who have technical skills and trade skills than they had access to before. But we still have an uphill battle and an uphill climb that we must recognize. So the struggle continues. yes, we have made some material benefits, but collectively, we've taken a few steps backward. And the steps that we've taken backward are not just based on material benefits per se, it's based on our social awareness and social consciousness. We took a major hit beginning in the early 80s and throughout most of the 90s. And that was because of the impact of the crack epidemic and how it was used as a tool or fuel for mass incarceration, right? And how it basically emptied the Black community of a lot of people, especially Black men. Yeah, Sister Tasha, we're not doing
Yes,
too good on time. I can tell when I
yes,
see your name pop up, I know something's about to be said.
it's a
All
little
right.
after 1:30, so maybe we should do a little
Oh,
feedback and then give you guys maybe 10 minutes to close.
okay. Sounds good.
Thank you.
All right. So I think now we probably need to open it up to any of the people who would like
Yeah,
to ask any questions or make any comments.
Yes, and Sister Zuri had her hand raised previously.
Okay. All right.
and I think she had raised it on slide number 4.
Okay. Zoe, did you have a question or comment?
No, it was an accident. I'm sorry.
Oh, an accidental question, accidental comment. All
It was
right.
it was an accidental hand raise. I apologize.
Okay. All right. No problem. Is there anyone else who would like to make any comments or ask any questions as we proceed?
Well, uh, during the course of you guys, speaking, you had mentioned the Black Liberation Movement
Mhm.
and how you feel as though there has not been any progression. How can we reignite that?
Oh, that's a very good question. I think it's already been reignited. I think it's been reignited since I would say 2014, 2013, 2014. I think that when we look at the community response to the murder, for example, of Trayvon Martin, I think that was really the beginning. Trayvon Martin, and then it was the public or state execution of I could not remember the brother's name. He had been
Mike
accused.
Brown.
No. Was it Mike Brown? It was a brother who was executed by the state. He
Troy
had
Davis.
Troy Davis, right? I think the beginning was the state murder of Troy Davis. Um,
That
I
was in
have
Georgia.
right. That was in Georgia. So I think that was the beginning. I think that was the beginning of the younger people, the younger generation, starting to sit up and take notice of what was happening politically as far as the criminal justice system. And I think the whole inequity and the injustice, the apparent injustice that functions within the criminal justice system has really been the spark of a new social consciousness and awareness, especially on the part of younger people. That's why we see so many young people taken to the streets. That's why we see so many young people taken to the airwaves, starting their own podcasts, using YouTube, using Instagram, using Facebook to convey their thoughts and ideas about what's happening within their particular communities and neighborhoods and what's going on with the relationships between the people and the police departments. So I think we've seen this movement be restarted or reignited since the state execution of Troy Davis, and then went from Troy Davis to the murder of Trayvon Martin, and the outcome. We know that the vigilante, the neighborhood vigilante, George Zimmerman, was never really held accountable. He got off scot-free. He continues to walk the streets today, and no harm has ever came to him, even though he executed a 17-year-old who was returning from a store on his way back to his father's apartment or on his way back to his father's home. So the murder of Troy Davis by the state of Georgia, the vigilante murder of Trayvon Martin in Florida, and then literally the straw that broke the camel's back was the police murder of Mike Brown in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014. That was the epitome. And so when that happened, that's when you see the first out and out rebellions, the insurrections and so-called riots. Because keep in mind, when Troy Davis was murdered, or leading up to his state murder, there were massive protests and demonstrations, but there really wasn't any violence, right? When Trayvon Martin was murdered, there were massive protests and demonstrations with just a few small incidents of violence. But when Mike Davis was murdered, it started, that ignited the whole pattern of the people would respond, not just with protests, not just with demonstrations, but they would demand that the police be held accountable, and they would tear something up, right? And so it has been reignited, the awareness, the consciousness, the determination, the fighting spirit that we found that existed a few decades earlier in the Black liberation movement. So even though the government and the police forces locked up and locked down many members of the Panther Party and the Republican New Africa and the Black Liberation Army, and also white allies and supporters such as SDS, the Students for Democratic Society, that transitioned, just like the Panthers and some elements of the RNA, Republican New Africa, and others also transitioned and held membership in the Black Liberation Army. You had members of the Students for Democratic Society and people who were anti-like imperialist warriors who protested against the United States waging wars in Southeast Asia. They transitioned into what became known as the Weather Underground, right? Which became an armed wing. So, you know, what the government thought they had completely destroyed and crushed completely has now reemerged. And if not necessarily the armed actions and interventions, the storytelling behind it, the narratives about it, the lessons learned because of it, the people still incarcerated who now folks are getting behind to free these people. So what the government thought they had completely destroyed has reemerged again. And so now there's more discussion, especially in light of what happened with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. Now people even have discussions about armed intervention, much in the same way that Huey and Bobby first discussed it, armed intervention 55 years ago. So that's where we are. It hasn't been completely crushed. It hasn't been completely destroyed. The elements still remain. We find those elements reignited in the work that we see happening throughout the country, especially with a lot of the young people in response to the murder of George Floyd and the murder of Breonna Taylor. Brian, I'm gonna ask you to take over again. I gotta step away again. So if you could bear with me.
No problem.
Thank you.
I've pretty much agreed with that response 100%. And as a member of the younger generation, I definitely agree with that, especially because those of us that are younger, we really see the contradictions. You know, it's like and now we can have it where we can see the incident broadcast right before our very eyes, and then the result that you know comes about isn't actually true justice. That sparks and inspires you to get involved. So I disagree with what Brother Khalid just said. I agree 100%, and that's my perspective on it.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, sure, no problem. Do we have any other questions?
So I wanted to make a comment, possibly a question at the end. I first wanted to thank you guys for the knowledge you set out today, because it was very informative for me. To comment, I would like to say that the first 4 questions went perfectly with the theme, and the theme is, where do we go here? And so the first question was, do we protest, boycott, whatever? And then you guys went into, how do we approach a collective solution, and what are examples of self-care, and what does hope and optimism look like? And when I'm listening to everything that was put out, it kind of says to me like, we don't protest or boycott or anything just yet. We approach that collective approach by teaching examples of self-care, which will instill hope and optimism. Brother Malcolm X said self-discipline. He spoke about self-discipline, self-respect, and love of race, which you and Brother Khalid touched perfectly on the self-discipline and self-respect within talking about self-care, which I have my own personal stories about that, which I won't share right now. And I think that what we're missing as a people, as a whole, is the love of race. And when you guys get to question 5 and 6 about the progress, there is some progress. Maybe the progress isn't where it should be because history is our greatest teacher. And maybe we didn't take the time to instill love of race by not helping more of our people become self-disciplined. It's a hard job. It was a hard job for me. And you guys state that the state of our young people is where Malcolm X was previously, and he had to teach himself to grow. And maybe for some of us who are here, it might be the position of the party to start by instilling self-respect and self-discipline, teaching self-care so that we all can have a love of race, and then maybe we can move forward. But that's just my thoughts and comments. Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate those comments actually, and what comes up for me, you know, if you talk about race first, you know, you're breaking it down even further from that. You know, it's family first, and like Brother Khalid was kind of referring to how we had such a, if you're looking at the time of the early '80s and '90s, how our families were so destroyed because of what happened with the crack epidemic and things like that, you know. So that major trauma that happened um, had a major effect on us being able to have the proper, like you said, self-care and being able to develop the proper hope and optimism, and be able to actually develop our families as they should. So I'm glad that you pointed that out, and it is, as we are in the seasons where we can be able to recognize how much of an importance that we need to prioritize healthy relationships within ourselves and our families, and as it spreads out further to a race and even to a human family. So I appreciate those comments.
And I thank you. I absolutely agree. I personally had to take the transformation in my own family. I had to work backwards with my children to bring them up. And so maybe that's the step we need to take collectively, because maybe collectively we have not healed that trauma that you mentioned as a whole. And we have a question. So thank you for your comments. From Brother Arnold, he said he'd like to know why the No Warrant initiative was not put on the ballot in some boroughs.
Thank you, Brother Arnold. That's a good question. And just for some clarification, are you referring to the ballot initiative here locally in Pittsburgh and Allegheny County regarding no-knock warrants? Is that what you're referring to, Brother Arnold? If you could just answer us quickly. Okay, I think this just put something in the Q&A. All right, so I could be wrong, but I think the no-knock warrants were specific to the city of Pittsburgh. I think that was a referendum question or ballot question specific to the city of Pittsburgh. I could be wrong. It sounds like it would be more like appropriate for it to be a ballot question, not just for the city, but for the entire Allegheny County. And if that be the case, then it should have been on the ballot throughout all the jurisdictions of Allegheny County. So if you went to vote and you didn't see that as a ballot question, then that was an error, if indeed it applied to no-knock warrants issued throughout Allegheny County. And it sounds reasonable that it would have been a question for all of Allegheny County and not just the city of Pittsburgh, because warrants are issued by judges and or even district attorneys and have to be signed off. And so, you know, yes. Aha, okay. Someone, Mel Packer, indicated that the no-knock was for the city of Pittsburgh and the solitary confinement, which I was aware that the solitary confinement ballot question was for all of Allegheny County because it involves Allegheny County Jail, which is not a city jail or prison, it's a county prison. So I was familiar with that part, Mel, but I was talking specifically about no-knock warrants. It sounds like that is a question that needs to be placed on the ballot for all of Allegheny County. Now, I've even heard that it didn't really make too much of a difference because technically in the city of Pittsburgh and perhaps throughout the county, they don't issue no-knock warrants. It's not a standard practice, and it hasn't been for a long time. But we would have to do some additional research to see if that is true.
There's another question in the Q&A, brother.
Okay. Please address how we can dismantle the strong police and correctional officers union. Well, that's another good question. But first of all, the police union here in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the strongest police union is the FOP, Fraternal Order of Police. The FOP was actually founded in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, back in 1915. The Fraternal Order of Police, or the FOP, is the largest police union in the United States of America, probably the largest police union in the world, unless there's a police union in India or China. If there isn't, then the FOP is the largest police union in the world. It has a tremendous amount of political power. Even though it was founded in Pittsburgh, its national headquarters, I do believe, is in Washington, D.C., which is its base of operations and lobbying on the national level. It has about 300,000 members. And then it has an auxiliary wing, the FOP Auxiliary Group, which consists of family members of police officers, judges, district attorneys, and other businesses, corporations, and individual sympathizers of the police. So it's a very powerful union. It's a very powerful entity to deal with. They grease the palms of politicians, and they grease the palms of judges as well. What I oftentimes say to people is that if you come across a politician who is proud to talk about how he or she has been endorsed by the FOP, that is a clear sign that you should not vote for him or her, right? That is not a person that you want to vote for, unless you support police corruption or you support police brutality and murder. And, you know, the cops getting away with anything. Now, if you support all that, then vote for that person. But if you stand opposed to those type of practices, then don't vote for that person. Excuse me for 1 second, Mel. Let me get this out first. Thank you. You know, again, the FOP is a very powerful union. And I think it's something that, you know, has to be dealt with. I think one of the ways to deal with it is to organize with other unions and ask those unions not to recognize the FOP, right? Have those larger unions take a firm position against the FOP, because again, the FOP is a union and it's a legitimate legal collective bargaining unit, right? I think if you get other unions to take a principled position against the FOP because of what it actually does in practice, right? How it supports qualified immunity for police officers, qualified immunity being a mechanism, a law being a mechanism where the cops are basically not held accountable, you know, for the crimes that they commit. That, you know, they're like immune from prosecution. They're immune from being sued because they're the police, right? So, you know, I think one of the steps, again, is to organize other unions and collective bargaining groups to push back against the FOP. That sends a different message to them because after all, they are a union. The other thing here locally is that there are efforts to organize and to push for more police transparency and more police accountability, ultimately community control of the police, right? There was a group that was formed here locally in Pittsburgh called Stop the Station, that gave birth to a campaign which they call Democratic Control of the Police. And they've put forth a draft proposal of a much stronger mechanism for police accountability on a local level here within the city of Pittsburgh. And that would really mean community control of the police, much in the same way that it was first articulated and described by groups such as the Black Panther Party back in the late 1960s. So that would mean community oversight, not just of police behavior and conduct, but community oversight over the hiring, over the firing, as well as the budget, right? And so real community control of the police. And so this new initiative called Democratic Control of the Police, these are some of the things that it's advocating and some of the things that it's pushing. So I hope that can help to answer some of what you put forward, Brother Arnold, and anyone else who had those type of questions.
So, Brother Khalid, we're a couple minutes out, about 8 minutes out. I don't know if you guys wanted to go ahead and close or take any more questions.
Oh yeah, we want to take any more questions connected to this. And again, this is about Brother Malcolm X and where do we go from here? And how Malcolm's life and his legacy and his writings informs us as to how we need to proceed from this moment on, in terms of not just pushing for justice, but pushing for freedom and liberation as well. Any other questions or comments as we move on? Brother Brian, anything you would like to share as we start to close out?
Well, first of all, I want to give a shout out to two of my aunts who were able to join the discussions today.
Oh,
It's great to have them on, and my Aunt Karen and my Aunt Marion. So they were able to join and support, and they are seasoned, and they have they actually spent a lot of time in the Oakland, San Francisco Bay Area, so we're around when the Black Panther Party was founded and things like that, so it's really nice to be able to have them on and supporting. And I talked to them a lot about their experiences and things like that over the years. So
oh, great. Great. All power to the aunts. All power to the people. All right, right on. Okay. Any other comments as we wind down? I think, Tasha, we just about on point. We're like...
let me go ahead and share my last closing comments. Give me 1 second here. And so basically, I would just like to reiterate, that we recommit our lives and our energies to the journey for freedom and liberation. Just like Malcolm did, he stayed the course, his life, and we can use his life and the lives of our other freedom fighters. We have many that we can look at as examples, a great cloud of witnesses that have their lives have been examples for us to follow, and we can use that, both male and female, to be able to encourage us. Ida B. Wells comes to mind, Harriet Tubman, Marcus Garvey, the list goes on. So, and if you don't know those names, check them out, find some of your own, and, do the work.
All right. All right. Thank you very much. Well, it's not really too much more for me left to say. I just want to thank you all who were able to get on this afternoon. And I want to thank you all for your comments and your questions and your answers. And thank you all for your participation. Again, this is our Claim Malcolm X Day / Malcolm X Commemoration Project for the year 2021. For those who may have missed it, we will do our best to post this on YouTube, on our YouTube channel, for people's viewing at their own, discretion. So we want to thank you all again for your participation. Thank you all for your questions, as well as your response and your answers. All power to the people and free the land.
All
And
power to the people.
yeah, for the members of the NAIP, we will not be meeting. We will not have our Sunday meeting tomorrow. We're going to bypass. So all power to the people, free the land. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and hope to see you all again soon. Take care.
Free the land.